Hello there, my name is Stephen Ryan, and under the nom de plume S. GOURIET Ryan, or Stephen GOURIET Ryan, I've written a number of scholarly true crime articles. I'm also an erstwhile actor, a lifelong artist, and a former commercial photographer. I was always interested in the Whitechapel murders, that is to say, the Jack the Ripper murders, but from the point of view of treating them as the genuinely important criminological cases worthy of serious study that they are, not just as the subject of so many ridiculously sensationalist pulp books. During a trip to London in 1996, I went out of my way to go to the Public Record Office, as it was then called, these days the National Archives, in Kew, Surrey, at which archive most of the surviving Ripper records are filed. In addition to other Ripper-related records, I photocopied the post-mortem report of Ripper victim Mary Kelly, which had been done by the foremost Home Office forensic expert of the day, Dr. Thomas Bond. This report had gone missing from the files decades after it was written because a senior Metropolitan Police officer had used it and other documents to illustrate his lectures on police methods and criminology. But after his death they were returned anonymously to Scotland Yard in 1988, presumably by a family member. When I got back to Sydney, I pored over this document at great length over many weeks, because I sensed that there was something about this which someone should have noticed. What I noticed was this. One or more pages at the end of the report were obviously missing. In a nutshell, then, as now, it was mandatory for all post-mortem reports to be signed and dated by the medico-legal expert who had conducted the post-mortem and who had composed the report. He also had to list his credentials at the end of it. This was so that such a document would meet the legal requirements expected when and if a murderer was ever apprehended and brought to trial. Another thing missing was also an obligatory item, namely the one cause of death without which death would not have taken place. Lastly, there was no comment section in which conclusions were drawn from the forensic facts discovered during the post-mortem. There was no information on the weight and condition of the various organs, nor was there any information on the victim's sexual or reproductive state. All these things were mandatory. Too much was missing which had to have been in the report originally. I published my findings in a cogently argued article which appeared in the distinguished scholarly medico-legal journal The Criminologist in the spring of 1997. A few years later it got much wider circulation and made a much bigger splash when it was reprinted and reissued on the website The New Criminologist. In the meantime, seeking to press my revelations further, I determined to look for more evidence of what should have been in a forensic protocol of the 1880s, and so searched among the forensic textbooks held by the State Library of New South Wales, here in Sydney. It's not a very substantial or impressive collection, I have to say, for it does not even contain a Dixon Man, the most famous and influential forensic textbook of all time. It does, however, rather surprisingly, hold a particular American forensic textbook long overlooked by Ripperologists, a book which was published only 5 or 6 years after the Ripper murders. This book was amongst a handful of others which entirely fortuitously I had sent for from the bowels of the library. As an initial exercise, I turned to the index of each book to see if there was any reference to either Jack the Ripper, or the Ripper murders, or the Whitechapel murders. One after another either had nothing on them, or else nothing new. But when I turned to this American forensic textbook of the late 1890s, I found to my very great surprise a reference to a number of pages on the Whitechapel murders, and with shaking hands I flipped over the pages to find the first page listed for them. What I saw there made my mind reel, my hair stand up on the back of my neck, and made me feel like I might even faint. Certainly my legs were turning to jelly, for true crime writers and researchers live for moments like this, and it was For what I had found was the text of some of the missing details from Dr. Bond's post-mortem report on Mary Kelly. The book did not name the victim, admittedly, but the case was absolutely unmistakable. In these paragraphs were forensic details which no one knew anything of, and in particular it stated flatly that it was Kelly's heart which had been cut out, and that it had been taken away by her murderer. This was something which had been such a closely guarded police secret that the press, who suspected that some organ had been removed, they thought that it might have been the uterus, were told forcefully by the police that no organ had been removed. Only one newspaper, The Observer, had reported at the time that it was the heart, citing an unnamed published report, but the existence of this item too was not known of until rediscovered by me in 1998. Furthermore, the acknowledgements page of the American textbook thanked the doctor who is known to have been Dr. Bond's colleague on the investigations for supplying the information. I proceeded to write a follow-up article on the first one, and it appeared in The Criminologist in due course in the winter of 1998. The provenance of this information is beyond dispute, for I was able to show incontrovertibly that Bond's colleague was present during both the initial investigation in situ in Kelly's room and later in the mortuary, and that the report was taken down at dictation by this doctor while Bond performed the autopsy. But this was not the only information which I found in the book, not by a long chalk. The editor of the book, or perhaps the American doctor who had written the chapter in question, had misunderstood other forensic information which Dr. Bond's colleague had included with the stuff on Kelly, and had presumed that this other information pertained to victims of the Ripper also. In point of fact, however, they were the texts of the post-mortem reports on victims of a contemporaneous murderer, the Thames torso murderer, which texts had the same, undoubtedly authentic provenance. This murderer had committed 4 known torso murders, both 1 year before the Ripper crimes and during the year of the Ripper's reign of terror, and 2 in the following year. Only one of the post-mortem reports on the last victim, the so-called Pynchon Street torso, is still extant in the holdings of the Metropolitan Police files at the National Archives at Kew, and there's virtually nothing surviving on the police investigations of the other 3 cases, so the discovery of this massive windfall of authentic forensic information on these mysterious cases was a very big deal indeed. I proceeded to write a scholarly article on these discoveries and their ramifications, but because there was so much new material arising from this find, the article grew and grew like Topsy, becoming first 2 articles, then 3, then a series of articles, all well beyond the length accepted by the criminologist. I therefore took steps to bring out my own true crime scholarly journal, to be entitled Studies in Black, as a vehicle for the publication of these lengthy articles, but when my mother had a stroke I dropped everything to look after her full time. One day, out of the blue, I got an email from the American editor of the distinguished true crime journal Ripper Notes, Dan Norder, who asked me whether he could publish these articles of mine, since he had been very impressed by my earlier ones. I told him that they were now very long indeed, but this didn't seem to faze him, since my mother needed caring for, I agreed to let him have them, not wanting to waste all that hard work. Norder therefore advertised the imminent publication of the first article in the series, but then, owing to circumstances beyond his control, he was subsequently unable to proceed, and the journal is now defunct. Eventually there was nothing for it but to convert this series of articles into a definitive book on the subject. Only 2 books have ever been written on them, and both of them were very poor efforts by any standard. I looked after my mother for 13 years until her death in March of this year. She had not been bedridden. In fact, I had taken her to London and Paris in 2010, 2011 and 2012, as well as in earlier years. Now that that period of my life is over, alas, I have decided that the time has come to finish the book at long last and get it published. But to do so, I would need to raise 8,750 Australian dollars by my calculations, for the cost of my mother's funeral broke me, as did a period of not feeling up to looking for employment for months afterwards. The book is very nearly finished, but because I am nothing if not thorough, I feel I need to go over the various archives in London one more time, and I certainly need to be in London in order to be taken on as a client of a true crime literary agent and a true crime publisher. The book is the best thing I have ever written and definitely deserves to see the light of day. I can even foresee it having the makings of a very good documentary in due course. All I need is a little help from a lot of kind souls via the possible crowdfunding platform. I would be very glad, therefore, if you would be good enough to consider whether you think this is a project worthy of your generous support. And I thank you for taking the time to listen to this.